From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. My name is Georgette Dorn, and I'm the head of the Hispanic Division of the Library of Congress. It is a great pleasure to welcome you all to this wonderful event. And I want to thank especially the Embassy of Brazil to have made this event possible and co-sponsoring it with us. I also want to thank the Poetry and Literature Center, our other co-sponsor. The Ambassador of Brazil is with us, and he will speak later on. Ambassador Figueiredo, welcome. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our speakers, Benjamin Moser, who is an editor, translator, critic, very well known, and the translator of Clarice Lispector's book, Why This World, and the editor of the volume that we're presenting today. Benjamin is from Texas, has a PhD from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands, and has written for many, many journals, including the New York Review of Books. And Professor Vivaldo Andrade is professor of Portuguese at Georgetown University. He is a graduate of University of California at Berkeley and is the author of Drummond Andrade, a very important Brazilian actor, author. Ambassador Figueiredo.
Good morning. I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us for this conversation on the life and work of Clarice Lispector. I'd like to thank first Ms. Georgette Dorn, the chief of the Hispanic Division, as well as the Poetry and Literature Center of the Library of Congress for hosting us today. I couldn't think, frankly, of a better venue to discuss Clarice Lispector, and I am pleased that we are able to partner with the Library of Congress on such an important event. Last week, I had the pleasure of visiting the library and meeting librarian David Mao, and I was introduced to the beautiful Portinari murals that are at the Hispanic Division. For those who haven't been there, I highly recommend it. I have also visited the Maps Division, which kindly organized a very special exhibit with rare and antique maps of my country, for what I am extremely grateful. Well, Vivaldo dos Santos and Benjamin Moser frankly need no introduction. I will just say that those who study Brazil in Washington will with no doubt have already be in contact and met Professor Santos due to his large and strong work for the benefit of the Brazilian culture in the whole DC area. And it is indeed a privilege for the embassy to be able to help bringing Benjamin Moser to Washington. He is, among many other things, a celebrated biographer of Clarice Lispector and the editor of this newly released complete stories. The first comprehensive English translation of Lispector's short stories on this beautiful edition very quickly, as you know, made the New York Times last year's list of 100 most notable books. it truly deserves it. And the attention it got only reflects the depth and the span of both the work of Clarice, but especially the work of Benjamin Moser. Mr. Moser states in his biography of Lispector that, and I quote, "She was both Brazil's greatest modern writer and, in a profound sense, not a Brazilian writer at all." In my mind, I must say that she really belongs to Brazil, as she once said, and deserves her place among the greatest Brazilian authors of all times. But at the same time, her deep understanding of the human soul defies all boundaries. And I am very excited about the discussion here, which sadly I will not be able to continue to attend due to other commitments. But I can't help but wonder how this mysterious woman would react if she knew that her work was to be discussed at the Library of Congress in Washington, a city where she lived, with such a nice and interested public. I think, in a certain way, that the answer to this and other questions will emerge in the context of today's conversation. So without further ado, I simply would like to thank you very, very much for your presence. And I hope you have a very interesting, certainly, and fruitful conversation about her. Thank you.
Ben will now read some selections for you before joining Vivaldo for a conversation.
So, obrigado, embaixador, and thank you, Georgette and Thalia and Jean and Vivaldo. It's great to be here. It's interesting to think what Clarice, I'm always too tall for these microphones. It's interesting to think what Clarice would have thought about being here, being honored this way in the city where she did live for the whole of the 1950s almost, and where she wrote a lot of the stories that are in this book. And they're very, it's interesting to say she's a Brazilian, she's not a Brazilian. They're very Brazilian. The stories are actually more Brazilian than the novels. I mean, it's very much these women, almost always women, living in a couple of neighborhoods in Rio, and almost always doing pretty much the same thing, and which is having their peaceful lives interrupted by some violent something. And it's very rarely a violent event, like a shooting or a murder or something. It's something that happens inside them. It's something that touches them somehow. And what's interesting, I've written about Clarice, so this is the first book that I wrote about her, Why This World, which is the biography that I published in 2009, also in Brazil and in the United States, and then in lots of other countries throughout the world. It's coming out in Holland next week, which is why I have to get back there. And it keeps going on and on. But it's part of a series this is now the 7th book of this series. So there's 5 of the novels that we've published in English, and now the stories, and then 6 more coming. So, get ready. It's not going to be as fast. I mean, I'm doing one a year. But having done that for so long, I got a little bit, I wouldn't say bored, because I always loved Clarice, but it's a lot of work doing other things. I have a real job besides doing Clarice, and it's been more than 12 years of this. And the thing about working with a truly great artist or truly great writers, there's always more to say. And when I was writing the introduction to this, I thought, haven't I already said everything about her? But it turns out I hadn't. And working through these stories in this way, from her first story that she publishes when she's 19 years old and she's a student, to the stories that she leaves incomplete as sketches on her deathbed, which are very fantastic stories too. You see this entire woman's life being written out in her life, throughout her life, but also writing about how women specifically change and grow. And so I wrote a little thing about this. I discovered that this was the first time a woman had ever done this anywhere. And this is, if you are familiar with feminist criticism, this is something that comes up a lot, especially in the 60s and the 70s when female cultural and intellectual achievement is starting to be reevaluated and starting to be brought out of the gutter, where it was always relegated because it was women. Even Virginia Woolf, until the 70s, was not considered good enough to be on any curriculum in this country or in England. And so there was this work for 2 or 3 generations of female scholars who brought this out of the closet and discovered. But one of the questions was, why had it not happened before? So I thought, why? It's interesting. She comes from an absolutely destitute background. She comes from really the dredges of society. I mean, she comes from a very poor, not even an immigrant background, but a refugee background. And she becomes, by the time she's a teenager and she's writing this story, she becomes famous as, in the literary world of Rio, but she becomes famous as not only the most beautiful girl in Rio de Janeiro, which was something, it's an accomplishment, but also this woman that everybody knew was a genius. And so I wrote this thing about her, and I'll just read it briefly and then we can talk. This achievement, so the other side of silence is speech. And there are a lot of silent women in these stories, women who can't speak or who are silenced forcibly by circumstances or by men. Today, women as writers and women as the subjects of women writers are so familiar that it is hard to believe that Clarice Lispector's characters or their lives ever needed to be discovered. But to see this work from the perspective of what came after it is to miss its historical novelty. Clarice was fundamentally without a tradition. She was an immigrant, and though she had the ancient European Jewish tradition behind her, that world, particularly in the tiny shtetl where she was born in the western Ukraine, was not easily adaptable to modern urban lives. And then in the literature of the language she wrote, the subject of modern women no more existed than did women writers themselves. Now this is kind of amazing if you think about what comes after it. There were a couple of Brazilian women who had written Cecilia Meirelles, but I mean, it was very, very tiny. And then I say, in this respect, Portuguese was no different from any other language, and Brazil was no different from any other country. Clarice was 9 when Virginia Woolf asked a question Clarice later quoted. Who shall measure the heat and violence of the poet's heart when caught entangled in a woman's body? The question, Woolf believed, applied as much to women of her own day as it did to women of Shakespeare's. This novelty explains some of the fascination and confusion that early readers of Hurricane Clarice, which is a title someone gave her, a friend of hers, one imagines a similar thrill of discovery among the first readers of Dickens and Zola and Dostoevsky, when literature first cast its light on the working classes, or when gay readers first saw their lives written about sympathetically, or when colonial peoples exchanged the condescension of folklore for the higher dignity of literature. The astonishment her achievement provoked is still palpable in the yellowing scrapbooks preserving the reviews in Clarice Lispector's archives. And so I want to just talk with Vivaldo about this a little bit and about other things too, and you're welcome to ask us questions if you'd like. The phenomenon of Clarice is a really emotional thing. We were at Harvard the other day, and Arthur said that he finally understood that Clarice is not a writer, she's a church. And it was really funny because it was a kind of long event, and I was screaming because there was no microphone. But everybody got up. It was like an evangelistic revival. Everybody wanted to talk, and of course it was a heavily Brazilian audience. And everybody wanted to get up and talk about how they had first met Clarice and what she had done to them and how she had affected them. And it really did get a little bit like a church. I mean, you felt like this isn't just a writer that people read in the way that you read something that's outside of yourself, that you read to learn something about, you know, the navigation of, you know, Ferdinand Magellan or something. You know, it's something that you read because you learn something about yourself and because it affects you in a way that is very hard to explain. And it's nice when you have Brazilians around because you don't have to really explain that to people. Because anyone who would come to an event who's Brazilian, who's read her in Portuguese, is obsessive almost by nature. So that's kind of who we're dealing with. We're not dealing with this iconic, great writer that is, you know, we're very respectful and you read it because you have to at school. You read it because you have to. And if you're susceptible to her, I think it's very easy to understand why I would spend this much time on her, and why, despite all the time I've already put in her, I'm excited to go forward and publish the remaining volumes in English. So thanks for coming, and Vivaldo, let's talk.
I just would like to thank the Library of Congress, the Hispanic Division, for the invitation, and also to be here, you know, sharing this space with Ben. And I feel very honored to be here. And first, the idea is to start a conversation, but also to open for comments and questions as we start talking. And I don't know if you want to start, or because you mentioned something about this passion for Clarice. I was as a professor, I've done my homework. I have all these questions. But one thing about that, for me, when I read Clarice, and when I read Clarice for the first time, there is something very special about Clarice. It has to do with language, but there is something about love. But not love in the idea of love that we used to, the romantic love. There's something that goes beyond love. Love for things, love for existence, the minimum things, the things that we don't really see. And there is, I don't know, something that when I read Clarice, it makes me feel more, let's say like more humane. It touches me in a certain way that like she has something it goes deep inside myself. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that's a little bit what has kept me going for all these years, is that there's a feeling of love that comes out of her that's it's not this romantic love at all. Clarice is extremely violent, and she's extremely cruel sometimes to her characters. And yet, there's a feeling of love that comes out, and she's very much someone who comes out of an experience physically and where she comes from in Europe. She comes from a place of destruction. She comes from a place where your life and you yourself can be absolutely wiped off the map for no reason, with no explanation. So there's a real refusal of, you know, what's behind romantic love is also an idea of Christian love, which is a love for an idea of a world that can be humanized, a world that can be made to look like us and to conform to our wishes. And you know what they say in the Baptist church, and not my will, but thy will be done. She doesn't believe in any of that. She thinks you're going to get destroyed and crushed like a roach. And that is actually true. That is where we're all going, unless you believe in life after death in some religious way. Physically, that's what happens. And that's what happens to the roach in the Passion according to G.H. And that's a symbol for all of us. You know, we are all just a bunch of tendons and veins and gross stuff that you don't even want to look at. I mean, you often can't look at it. And that's the thing I was interviewing a photographer the other day in connection with my biography of Susan Sontag, and I'm writing about Annie Leibovitz, which is, you know, part of this history of photography that's in this book. And this guy, I was talking to him, and he said, "Oh, look on my website, and there's all this stuff." And he had gone to medical school, and I said, "Okay, I'll look on your." So I clicked on it, and he had taken all these pictures of surgery and what happens in surgery, all very beautifully lit, like the Rembrandts that you see in The Hague or in Amsterdam of dissections. And that is actually, I thought of Clarice, because you can't actually look at it. It is horrifying to look at like a brain and a thing with like blood everywhere. I mean, I guess doctors get used to this, but most people don't like to look at that, and they don't like to think of what they're actually made of, which is that. And so she rejects this aestheticized, humanized version of life, but at the same time, and this is a really great richness of her, she accepts that status of us as mortal beings, and she elevates it in this absolutely divine way. So she makes the stuff that we don't want to think about and that we historicize or aestheticize, and she makes it beautiful. And I think that's maybe one of the reasons that people are so grateful to her, because she gives you a way of going into your life and not understanding it in some mythological fake way, but in a very real way that accepts and that understands what we really are.
I agree with you, and I also think that there is I think Clarice is different from most of the existentialist thinkers, the idea of nothingness or nothing, and she goes beyond that. I think you mentioned that in your biography about comparing her to Kafka, for example, because I think for Clarice it seems to me there is a need for confrontation with the self, for who we are, and in order to really, it's always like a search, like digging to the existence. She's always, seems to me, she's always kind of excavating what's after death, what's after this. But she really, one thing that really called my attention when I read her, she really, all those things that we don't want to see, it's kind of abject, that she forces us to look at them and to learn that we have this, we also have this very nature, humans, but also very close nature to ourselves, and we need to embrace that kind of nature as a whole being.
Well, that's interesting because, when you say she forces you to look at things that you don't want to look at, that could mean two things. I'm very much opposed to, and I very much don't watch, for example, violent films or films about murdering children or this kind of stuff that I don't want to watch. I know this exists in the world, I think we all do, but it's not that kind of forcing you to look at stuff that you didn't want to look at in a voyeuristic way, because that's something that also comes up in the history of photography. What is a picture of war that is meant to educate and spur people to action, and what is just obscenity? Clarice is never obscene. I mean, Clarice is extremely elegant, and her language is extremely beautiful. And part of the project of translating all these books, I coordinate this project, and I said it's now the 6th volume that we've done, is getting that language right. Because if you don't get the language, then it can become shocking in the wrong way. It should be shocking in a right way. It should be both extremely beautiful and extremely appalling, often. And in these very, she lived in Chevy Chase, Maryland for many years. She was a very, she looked like an upper middle class housewife. She was married to a diplomat. She had really nice clothes. She had good hair. She had nice makeup. And all of this stuff she just takes off in these stories. She just strips it all away, and she shows what's really happening. And but it's never obscene. It's just a way of, I think she thinks that hair and makeup and things like this are really important to people. She thinks that it's important to have a face to present to the world. You can't walk around with exposed intestines all the time, which, you have to have a way of getting through your day and then picking up your kids and going to the grocery shop, and that's what she writes about. And because she situates it in these very ordinary, recognizable parts of the world, it's even more powerful than if it was.
You mentioned the question of language. I think it's a very key. Language plays a very key role in Clarice's works, and also I think I don't know. My question has to do with translation. Also, your challenge is to translate someone that kind of language in Clarice that's very stream of consciousness, that's not very direct. There is always like one thing about when you read Clarice, for example, you have to, I don't want to say force, but I write, and so for me I pay attention to words. Words has different layers, and it seems like Clarice, it's always trying to reveal something when she chooses a word, and it makes us kind of dig for some sort of meaning that kind of escapes, and she's always kind of, as I said, I go back to the idea of excavation, and in her literature, all these digressions, introspection, and how you deal with that in terms of working with her in translating.
Well, I mean, it should be said, I don't know, I think I'm just looking at faces. I would say there's half Brazilians here today. Is that about right? Okay. I would say, if you read her in Portuguese, the funny thing about her is that she doesn't sound like a normal Portuguese writer. I mean, there's not a single sentence in Clarice that's a normal way that any Brazilian would ever say anything. And yet, it's very readable. I mean, you always know what she's saying. It's not obscure in a way that, like Guimarães was as obscure, that you think, what does he mean by that? And you'll probably never know because it's like an allusion to an Icelandic song from the Middle Ages. But with her, you know what she's saying, but then when you actually try to figure out what she's saying, as a translator does, and so, you know, I've worked with now 5, 6 translators, bringing these works out, and my job is, in a lot of ways, I mean, of course, it's an editorial role of like correcting people's Portuguese if they miss a word or that kind of thing, but it's more trying to get a unified voice for her, because in Portuguese it's such a recognizable voice. And when you actually go through it word by word, it's extremely difficult. And so my introduction to the stories, I mean, in the biography, this is the whole story of that, of why her language is so strange. But if you go through it word by word, the sentences just fall apart. They actually don't mean anything. And, or they mean everything. But the degree to which you as a reader are supposed to fill it in is really exciting, actually. And it's one of the things that draws you into her, because you want to get closer to it and you feel that this is something really grandiose and spectacular, and I don't totally get it. So you have a kind of feeling of being somewhere, and kind of like in a museum where you think like all the other stuff is like right in the next gallery, but it might be closed, and you might have to go around somewhere else, and you might have to. So it kind of sucks you in. There's a labyrinth feeling to her, and she, as I write about in Why This World, her idea of language really does come from Jewish mysticism. And this becomes very obvious that she has that tendency, which is to move words around, to move things around, to try to hint at something that you can never see. And the ultimate thing you can never see and you can never reach in Jewish mystical practice is the name of God, which is something that you both are obliged to seek while still knowing that you'll never find it, because if you speak the name of God, then you bring about the end of the world, literally. So you shouldn't do it, and you can't do it, but you have to do it anyway. So this is, it has all these metaphorical extensions. So, you know, you have to put on makeup and go to school every day, even though you know you're going to die. You know, you have to do all these things in life that are useless. And, you know, I have to write books. And we were at the other side of the street yesterday, and they showed that they treat books for 1,000 years at the Library of Congress. So they put them in gas chambers, and they treat them with some gas. Is that right, Georgia? I mean, I don't know what. Yeah, and they treat them, and that guarantees them a life of 1,000 years. Okay, well, even if 1,000 years is a really long time, a lot of barbarians could invade the District of Columbia before 1,000 years is up. I mean, a lot of things happen in history, so you don't know that it'll be preserved. But even if it is preserved for 1,000 years, you know, what is 1,000 years compared to geology? So we all do these things. I mean, I write these books, and she wrote these books, and I'm very proud of them, and she was happy about them. But they're gone, you know, in a certain time. And so you do all these things not because you are denying that, but because you are knowing that, and because you want, in that short space that you're allowed in the world, to make something beautiful and to leave something behind, and to make something of yourself, but not in a delusional, grandiose way, in a humble way.
It's interesting. You mentioned the idea of history, for example. When I read The Hora da Estrela, everything starts with a yes and ends with a yes. But she was kind of, I don't know, a sense of history, like a prehistory of time and things. There's always this continuous search. And you mentioned language. To me, it seems very funny. Clarice is very funny when you read her, especially like if you read Macabea, for example, the way she uses language. We kind of laugh because Macabea is this character that seems kind of idiot, stupid, but there is something about that kind of she's ignorant, and Clarice says like there is a beauty in ignorance, that she's trying to create this character that doesn't know anything, that's really learning about life, that really experienced language for the first time, kind of pre-verbal. It's kind of a child, almost an animal. And Clarice is always kind of going after that kind of characters and ideas about kind of pre-verbal language, as you mentioned in the Jewish tradition, like the mystics, like a digging, and to read something that always evades you.
Yeah. Well, and Macabea, this is the character in The Hour of the Star, which is Clarice's last book, where Macabea, as you know, if you know anything about Brazilian literature, you know that she's killed. And the reason you know this is there's been all these movies, and it's a tiny book, so it's not really giving anything away. And she pretty much says this at the beginning. Macabea is like this roach. She just gets smushed. She gets run over in a car. And yet, in that time that she has, she's still able to create something really beautiful that is behind knowledge. So it's funny to be writing about Susan Sontag, who is somebody who so believed in the mind and in knowledge. Clarice doesn't. Clarice was not an intellectual. She was always looking for, at the same time, you should say she was one of the most learned women of her generation, and not only in Brazil. She was one of the first journalists and one of the first lawyers in Latin America. She was a very, obviously, very intelligent person, but she wasn't interested in book learning and footnotes. She was interested in learning about what the world was really like. That's why my book is called Why This World? She was interested in these much bigger questions that can be obscured by all this, what she would call sophistication, which, it's Agua Viva, she calls the first title is Além do Pensamento, beyond thought. She's interested in that, and not what's on the surface. So that's reflected in language, and it's very fun. I have to say, it's really fun to work with her because you always are seeing something that you wouldn't see. And it's often really stupid stuff. That's what's great about Clarice, is it's so obvious that you would never have thought of it. And that's really something that I have found time and again. I think, God, I can't believe I never thought of that. It's so obvious. But it's almost the kind of stuff that that children say, for example. And you think, wow, that was really well put for a 3-year-old. And like a grown-up would never have said it.
No, it's interesting what you just mentioned, because I think Clarice, someone asked her, like, she has a reputation of being hermetic. And she's like, I understand myself.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting what you're saying, because when I read Clarice, it does, the first time you think she's talking about something like it's hard to understand, but she's basically, if she's looking at things basically through like a lens that makes things like really reveal things to you. The basic things like an egg that breaks when the woman is shopping, and we start, this is like quotidian things that happen in the daily life, and the way she presents it makes us to, it's like this is basic life, and she's very grounded. There is a scene also in the Jardim Botânico, the Botanic Garden in Rio, with Laura, the character one of her short stories. You think she's talking about this kind of Eden garden, something very obscure, but she's just describing how things really are, just emphasizing nature, for example. So there is nothing existential. You can think about existentialism, like Camus, for example. But when you read her, it's like, this is just her way of looking at things. It's very direct, and it's very quotidian, like the chicken and the egg, for example. So it's very simple, very direct.
It's very simple, and then it's very, very, very sophisticated. That's what's fun about going through it as an editor, as a translator, biographer, is you get a chance to read her not only from A to Z, which is always interesting, I think, in any writer. To read everything they wrote is really a great experience. If it's a good writer. If it's a bad writer, it's a horrible experience. But if it's somebody that was worth talking about in the first place, you see this evolution, and you see how the directness is there, and the obscurity is there too, and it's fun to be able to both understand something and not understand something. And with her, and a lot of the stories, especially, they're very much on the surface. They're very direct stories of some, like Anna, who is talking about coming back from the grocery store, and she has these eggs. The tram kind of shifts, and the eggs break in her grocery bag, and this drives her insane. Literally, by the time she gets off the train, she is nuts, and And then she goes to the garden and she sees these plants. And instead of saying, "Isn't nature beautiful?" she says something like, "It was full of rotting brains." You know, it was all these like flowers that were just fading away on the ground, and all this stuff in nature was this cruel thing. And she, but again, just as happens in normal people's lives, and it certainly happens in my life, and I'm sure that anyone here knows this feeling, is you do get back together and go to the dinner party, you know? You have these moments and you just like, oh, the world falls apart, and it's just like you're gonna, but most people, unless you really go mad, which does happen, and happened to Clarice's son, which is a very, you know, he had that oversensitivity that she had, that she could go and she could come back, and go and come back, and he just went, and she writes not about him, but she does write about the mad. Most people don't go mad. Most people get on with it. Most people figure it out and they get up and they go on, and I think that there's a beauty to that, really, is that you can step out of your life for no reason, and it can be a minute, and you come back and then you go on because you have to.
I think we want to open for questions and comments, and we can throw more questions you can have. There is a microphone.
Or you can just shout.
I'll project.
Project. Okay, good.
So you just touched a very interesting subject for me, which is madness, because she talks about madness throughout, like, a lot of stories and a lot of books, and so I was interested in hearing what you think about what her idea of madness was, and if that has any relationship with what she calls freedom all the time. She's also searching for freedom, debating with her freedom, and talks about that all the time.
Well, freedom, you know, is something she's very skeptical of. She is not interested in political freedom particularly. And this is why, I mean, she writes a lot of this stuff during the dictatorship in Brazil. And of course, I mean, she is what we would consider in this country, she would be a Democrat. You know, she was a pretty left-wing, but not communist, which in that day was a big divide, especially in anywhere in Latin America. She was, you know, what we would consider a pretty normal center-left person. So of course she was against torture, she was against dictatorship, all these things. But that wasn't the freedom that interested her. And the freedom that interested her was a kind of soul freedom, and a kind of how do you create yourself in a sense that that allows you to experience freedom. She would never think that freedom was a permanent state. You know, something you once, like a city that you get to, and then you just check into a hotel and you stay there. You know, it's something you can visit, but there's all sorts of unfreedoms just in people's lives. The madness question, I mean, the real book about madness that I think is interesting, that's in the next series that we'll be publishing, is The Apple in the Dark, Maçã no Escuro, which is an experience of mystic madness. And it takes place, as always with her, in this very boring place, which is this farm in the interior of Minas Gerais, I think, but it's not really named, you know, kind of nowhere Brazil. You know, it's just a farm, and it's a few people sitting on the farm and doing things, and he cleans out the stables, and he milks the cows, and all this kind of stuff. And you realize he's insane. And she writes in that book a lot about how this delusion can lead to a mystically and spiritually productive thing. The man, Martin, his name Martin, he thinks he's killed his wife. Now you don't really hear this until the very end of the book, and you think, when you think it, you think, wow, he killed his wife, that's terrible. It's going to be like Agatha Christie or something. But she's not interested in that at all. This crime, and this is why it's the apple, like the apple in the dark, the apple of knowledge from the tree of Eden. He uses this crime to achieve this mystical knowledge, but it's not, and so she thinks that madness is a productive state, but she also knows what real madness is. I mean, there are a lot of writers, like, if you think in Brazilian terms, like Augusto Anjos, or some of these people who think of madness as sort of admirable in some way. She does not think madness is admirable. I mean, this is part of her being a normal person. She does not. She knows what madness is. Madness is shocking and horrifying, and it destroys people and it destroys everyone around them. So it's a more productive, creative, artistic madness, and that is something that she channeled a lot, but she never entirely ceded to. Although I think, it's pretty clear at the end of her life she wants to. She would like to give in. And she dies very young. She's only 56 when she dies. And you feel when you read those last books that she's ready to go. Like, you don't think, wow, I wish she'd lived 25 more years. Like, she really was done. And artistically she was done, and she creates this arc in her work that is complete. Like Maccabea, The Hour of the Star, that's her last book. And that's exactly how it should be. She says, the last word is yes. And then she's off stage. So I don't know if there's.
Okay, maybe you already answered it, but anyway, I'm putting a question. Do you think she was attached to life, and how the act of writing was related to it or not?
I think, well, yes, she was attached to life. She really did love life, and she's not a dreadful, sad, black person, like, just everything's heavy and miserable. She's not that person at all. She's actually, and the humor that you see, also, not just jokes and things like this, because she's very Jewish. I mean, his jokes are sometimes like Groucho Marx, sometimes. I mean, there's a sort of voice there. But she was very funny, and she was very fun. People loved her, It's very interesting to compare it with Susan Sontag, who everybody was interested in, and people loved her, but they also hated her, but everybody loved Clarice. Nobody, and I talked to hundreds of people about her in Brazil and all over the world. People loved her. I mean, sometimes she'd be in a bad mood or something, but she was, her attachment to life was very physical. It was very sensual too. It was about water or a book, or it wasn't outside of what her life actually held. She loved animals, she loved children. She was a very normal person in some ways, except that she was a great genius. We were just at Emily Dickinson's house last week. And it's sort of similar, except that Emily Dickinson never left her room for 40 years. But you get a feeling of Emily Dickinson of, you could portray her as crazy. But in fact, what she wanted to do was right. And she chose that in a world where that was a hard choice to make, even for a woman like Emily Dickinson or Clarice from an intellectual family and who had enough money to be able to do it. She loved it, and the writing is full of that joy, I think.
Yes, and she says something about, like, a quote actually from your book, when I don't write, I'm dead.
Yeah.
She always says this thing, because writing is a way for her to overcome death, the meaning of writing, so you see that all over her texts, and I think she mentions in her interview, like, how she doesn't consider herself, or didn't consider herself a writer, but more like a mother, things like that, and she really, she's all this negativity that we see in this tradition, but she's not, as Ben pointed out, she's not that negative in terms of the dark, if you apply.
Can you talk a little bit about what the translator, Katrina Foxy, brought to the project, and how you guys worked together?
Yeah. Well, so as I said, Katrina, who did this book, was, I keep getting it wrong, I think it's 7 books, so it's 5, so she's the 6th in a series of translators who've done it, because we've done it. It's a project that's pretty interesting. I'll just speak about it for 1 second, but Portuguese is a language, like most languages, actually, unless it's Spanish or French. Most languages are underrepresented by good translators. So this is what you're starting out with if you think, I want to translate a great Brazilian. Well, the problem is there's not that many people to do it. So I liked, me and the publisher, we decided to take younger people who hadn't really had much experience and give them a classic author and work with them, line by line and page by page. And with the idea that we would then create new people who would then go out and translate other stuff and make it easy for Brazilians to be in English, because now that English is so dominant internationally, it's very hard. Oh, thank you. It's very hard. It's very hard to have an international career if you're not translated into English. It used to be you could be translated into German, you could be translated into French, you could be translated into Spanish. So what well, I guess what my role, I mean, and then you can hear a little bit about what Katrina did specifically, but the every translator, just like every person, has a very different voice. So the real challenge for me and for Katrina, who was the last of this series, I mean, more will be coming, but would be not only to make Clarice's voice unified in English, but also to make it unified in terms of how the other people wrote Clarice, which is another way of saying translate Clarice, in another language. And so there was a real, it's a challenge in two ways. Not only is Clarice difficult, but it has to be in this series without sacrificing individual voices. And I think Katrina's real talent for this was not only having this one voice of Clarice's and of my, whatever we invented for her, but also in a book like this that has a million voices, because there's all these different stories. I mean, if you're translating a novel, no matter how difficult the novel is, it basically, you get it, you figure out how to do it, and then you keep going, and then to the end, you know. But here, it's like 5 pages, and then you have a totally different voice, and new characters, and new social and economic and political circumstances, and new times, and so it's a very difficult thing. And you know, she just won the Penn Translation Prize last week, or this week, and you know, so it's a really, I think that is a recognition of just how daunting this project is. It's not easy, to put it mildly. So I saw you next door to you with somebody else. Yeah.
I've heard that Clarice wrote Apple in the Dark when she lived here in
Yes.
Chevy Chase, and it was quite a surprise for me because it's very close to my house and it's my favorite book. And I'd like to know a little bit more about her experience here in the U.S. and what happened to her, if she was among the community of writers, she had other friends.
Well, I talk a little bit about this in the biography. She lived at 4311 Ridge Road, if anybody's familiar with Chevy Chase, which I went there last time I was in Washington about 6 months ago. And it's funny because it's the only house, you know, this being America, we tear down anything that's over 20 years old. So all the houses on the street are gone and replaced by McMansions, you know, except for her house, which is still there. And I've actually wanted to go, maybe people want to come, we can all go on a field trip. I wanted to get in the house, and I slept out there. It was like a $70 cab ride, you know how, I mean, or Uber or whatever. So we went out there, and it was really freezing. It was really cold. This was maybe 2 years ago. It wasn't the last time. It was winter because it was cold. And there was Clarice's living room and her front door and her window and all this stuff that really felt exciting for people who are into her. Just to think of her on this boring suburban street writing these completely insane books, one after the next, with her perfect hair and going to the embassy reception and then, you know, taking care of the kids. It's amazing to see it if you have that in your head. I'm really hopeful. Paulo, her son, wrote me yesterday. He said, oh, you know, go see if the house in Chevy Chase is still there, because that's where he was born. Actually, he was born at George Washington Hospital. But he grew up there, and he said, for me, the word, he said, homesick always came for me before saudade. Because he was then, you know, she separated from her husband, returns to Brazil in 1959, and he was an English-speaking kid who was from Washington. I mean, he went to school in Chevy Chase. And suddenly he's brought back to this world of Brazil at an age where he was certainly old enough to know that he had left something behind, and he had, you know, it was hard, and his parents broke up. So, you know, Washington is an important place for him, not only as his birthplace, and it was an important place for her. And the writers that she had here were only 2, really. Brazilians will always, well, anyone international will come through Washington. I mean, it's a big city, it's a capital. People do show up here, but the only people who really lived here were Érico and Mafalda Veríssimo, who were her best friends. And Érico Veríssimo was a very famous writer from the south of Brazil, from Rio Grande do Sul. And he was the head of something at the Organization for American States, like one of those jobs that people have there. And so they came here and they drank milkshakes and they took pills. They took like, I can't remember what it was, but you know those pills that people took in the 50s and like you'd fall asleep in the middle of the street. So she and Mafalda would do that and just spend the afternoon being zoned out in a diner. It's a great image. I mean, if there's any painters here, I would, it's like an Edward Hopper painting. It's like you see Mafalda in a diner, like slumped over the milkshake. But she, Washington never shows up in her work. Europe, where she lived for many years, never shows up in her work. She went all over the place. The only place she's really interested in is Rio and Recife. She doesn't write about Bahia. She doesn't write about São Paulo. She doesn't, the place of her childhood and her early years. Those two. That's all she writes about. Yeah.
I'm sorry. No, it's just when I read the biography you wrote, what I was wondering is because I always thought about how can a foreigner read in Portuguese? I mean, I of course, if you translate it, as you said, you have to be careful, etc. So maybe people have a sense of that. But when you're reading in Portuguese, I mean, I don't know how to say this. Maybe today, if you compare, I don't know how much you knew Portuguese by then when you found out about her, but if you compare the understanding or the grasp or the depth, I don't know, or because for me it was something almost like an impossible task to think how can you actually get it.
Well, my Portuguese is good. Modéstia à parte. My Portuguese is fine, but and it became better and better and better. And I read her for many years, and I guess the real answer. I mean, Portuguese is something you can learn. You can learn a language. You go, you get a dictionary. You study it. There are classes, for these things. But the thing is that you really, I mean, it's funny with Clarice, like you either understand her or you don't understand her, and you can actually understand a lot if you don't know Portuguese very well. If you understand her, if you don't understand her, I can't explain it to you. And I've had this with Brazilians who just don't understand her. They think, like I don't understand why are these people obsessed with her, and so you can. But I would say that as a more general answer to that. Every reader's experience of a writer is different, and whether it's a language or, I mean, you're a woman, for example, you'll read her differently than I will. You come from somewhere different, you have a different life experience, you read different books when you were a kid. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're black or you're gay or you're Mexican or you're whatever. You're going to bring something different to it. So I don't have any thinking that what I have dug out of her is the final word. Clarice is called, in Brazil it's called Clarice Vírgula, Clarice Coma is the title of the biography, and that was because that wasn't my idea, it was somebody else's idea. But it was because there's never a final word on her, there's never a period. So, you take, and I'm sure I miss a lot of stuff, but with Clarice it's such a rich body of work that you're always going to miss something.
When you say about she was full of life, and I believe Agua Viva is one of the books that just show that. She's saying in the moment, here and now, and she's kind of full of life on that book. And then you say about the Maçã no Escuro, it's completely opposite, the other side. How do you feel when you did Agua Viva, for example?
Well, that's an interesting comparison actually, because Agua Viva is really tiny. It's like 80 pages long.
Yes.
And it's written like, wow, here's this crazy lady writing up thoughts. Woo, woo, And actually, it took her years and years and years to write that book. It's very, very carefully written. And if you see the manuscripts, she goes through, I think, 5 full total rewrites of that book. Maçã no Escuro was the other book that she rewrote. She actually rewrote it 11 times, which is just horrible, because that's her longest book. And it's like 500 pages almost, and it's a hard book to read. It's very intense, and thinking about writing it is even worse, and then thinking about rewriting and then rewriting and rewriting. So actually those books are more similar than they look like. But this is 20 years later, and Clarice has this much more poetic style by then. She's removed all these elements of the plot. If you read Maçã no Escuro, she never was interested in the plot anyway. it's like 300 pages of like he's like cleaning out the bathroom, you know, whatever he's doing. I mean, nothing really happens. And you know, there's if you remember, there's the rainstorm that's coming. I think it takes like 400 pages for the rainstorm to come. Like it really just comes, and they're like, no, another day and no rain, and there's the cloud that's getting a little closer, and none of that matters to her. I mean, that's not the point of the book. The point is what's happening in the people and in the language. So I think she's both very different and she's very similar. And I guess learning about her life shows you how she constructed these books that seem very different.
I have a couple of questions.
Sure, go ahead.
There are two things that I think there are people in the audience that I know would be interested and they know. One is animal, think of Valeria, and another is music. Those are very important things and have a strong presence in Clarice's work. Could you elaborate a bit?
Well, in Agua Viva, you know, she says that what she's interested in is not music, but it's putting her hand on the record and feeling the vibrations of the music, which is very beautiful. And we live in part of the year in southwestern France, which is where the cave paintings are. And you know, the very oldest art in the whole world is there. And I feel like it's so Clarice, you know, it's like there's nothing really there. You can kind of see it sketched out, but you have to fill it in. You have to imagine this antiquity of where this comes from, this layer under a layer under a layer under a layer. And I think Clarice liked animals because she had been often disappointed by people, which is something we've all been familiar with. She's not the only one. And so she loved animals because they were physical and they were warm and they were, and they didn't think. I think that's maybe really an important part of animals. And music too. You know, music doesn't have words. I mean, it can have words, but what makes music music is the sound, not the words. And it's part of the idea of getting beyond thought and getting beyond these kind of constructions of ourselves that she was just really not interested in. I think she saw through that. She thought that was a tool, you know, just like clothing. And she was a feminine, you know, as I say in Brazil, a feminine columnist. She wrote about makeup and hair and clothes for years, every day in the papers in Rio. So she knew how women were supposed to look, or men. She wrote advice about how to use perfume and how to use mascara, which is hilarious if you know anything about her. I mean, she's like the most radical thinker, I think probably the most radical thinker of the 20th century. Like when you think about like the existentialists, I would maybe accept Camus, but some of these people like Sartre, I mean, it's so boring and overthought after you read her. You know, she's, and that's why I quote in the very beginning of the biography, this old Kabbalist from the 13th century who gets in Spain somewhere very upset with these people. He said, you know, you ought to know that, you know, where you end, we begin. Speaking to the philosophers. And mystics are not philosophers. They're beyond that.
It's one.
I'm sorry, just to.
Yeah.
A couple of years before she died, she gave a Brazilian TV big interview, and you probably saw that.
I subtitled it.
Yeah, but she was kind of really, for me, she looks really sad, you know, the last time, and then she said, I don't understand myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, she said that about all the books that she wrote, and I don't understand myself.
Well, Clarice was very fakely modest, oftentimes. She knew exactly who she was. Just like you think, didn't Emily Dickinson probably know who she was? She must have. You know, you can't have that level of thinking. That video was not a couple of years before she died. It was a few months before she died. She was dying when she gave that interview, which is a great interview because it's the only time she ever spoke on television. And fascinatingly enough, that interview was something. She was interviewed by a journalist, and he actually went mad after that interview in a certain way. I spoke to him. He was a little bit crazy at the end of his life, but because of that interview. And he had this thing he said once to me. He said, neither Kafka nor Dostoevsky nor Fernando Pessoa would ever be interviewed. I had her, and I fucked it up. So he felt the weight of this historic responsibility And actually, his interview, she shows up. She was visiting Sao Paulo. She was in the studio with her friend Olga, who was kind of her companion at the end of her life, and would take her around and put her in a taxi and all this. And she walked into TV Cultura, which is the old sort of PBS or whatever of Brazil, and she walked through the door and she said, "You can interview me now." And she was like the most famous writer in Brazil, and she had famously never been interviewed. And she just walked in and she said, "Okay, I'm ready." And there was total panic. And everybody ran to try to get her a studio and get her a thing, and and find this guy who was like, I don't know, smoking a cigarette or like eating lunch. They said, "Come on, it's Clarice." And it's fascinating that that interview is so powerful, because everybody who sees it, I just sent it to Holland last night because they're for a television thing, and the woman who watched it was amazed. She'd never seen it before. The power that comes out of this dying woman, and that's why I think every Brazilian has seen that interview, because it's so unforgettable. I mean, it's a powerful thing.
Maybe we have one. We'll take one more question and then we'll.
Sorry, I'm a little under the weather.
Oh.
I wanted to hear a little bit more about the role of religion in her, her writing and for her. And I don't even know how to formulate this question, but it's very curious to me, about being Jewish, and then you see her books are so autobiographical for me that you see different facets and different directions that she goes about that. Do you want to talk?
Well, so Clarice comes from a rabbinical family. She comes from, this is obvious if you know Jews and if you know where Jews come from, especially in terms of class and education backgrounds. These things go, as they did in Europe, they went from generation to generation, and the rabbinical families were the same people. She comes from that background. And what happens to her at the very beginning of the book, I tell the story of the disaster that happens to her family, that happened to hundreds of thousands of Jews after the First World War, even before the Second World War, which was even worse, but hundreds of thousands of people killed. Her grandfather was murdered. Her mother was raped and got syphilis and died in Brazil. All of their being nice to God didn't work. This is the point. All of the 613 commandments and the, do 3 dances around the Megillah and all this kind of stuff, complete failure. Nothing about that. And these were religious people. They were they were forced to see the failure of this human-centered existence, or this human-centered idea of God, which is that God is this basically benevolent guy who, if you do certain things, like if you clean out the crumbs from your pantry in April, and if you, cut the foreskin off your kid, then basically God's gonna, he's sort of like a touchy parent, but it's basically an idea of God as a human that can be pleased or displeased, and he can get mad, and he'll be happy if you do this or that, so you have to do these little dances. That's a ridiculous thought. I mean, it's a ridiculous thought even as I'm formulating it now, but it's because it actually is ridiculous. It is not the reality of anybody's life. And it's not the reality of physics or astronomy or anything. And yet, what's so fascinating about her is the spiritual impulse, as opposed to the religious impulse, is still there. And it's 100% there, and it's not just there in a way that is some kind of legacy. If this is my family, used to be in clothing, so I love a good suit. It's not like that. It's something really deep. And she uses this expression to not to ridicule religion, but to find some other spiritual values. And she finds them where the Jews had always found them, which was in language. And that's, I think, what you feel of the beauty if you read her, especially if you read her in her own language. And so, of course, it's something she regretted, losing that. Because it's comforting to believe that if you just do these certain things and everybody's happy and you don't get cancer. But of course you do get cancer, and you do die, and you do suffer horrible things. Your child can go mad, and your mother can die, and these things. So it's a very complicated thing, but it actually becomes more beautiful because the hocus pocus gets taken away from it. And what you have is this desire to connect with something divine. And she does. So on that note.
Thank you very much, Ben
Thank
Moser
you.
and Devaldo Santos. And Ben will be signing books outside. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.